Every map she had ever drawn had a blank space at the center. Not a mistake, not an oversight. Sable of Thornwick had been making maps since she was 9 years old, had been Myra's apprentice since she was 14, and she understood better than most people who had ever held a compass that there were two kinds of blank space on any map. The first kind was ignorance, territory you had not yet surveyed, land that waited patiently to be known. The second kind was something else, something that resisted being known, something that pushed back against the pen. The blank space at the center of every map Sable drew was the second kind. She had never spoken of it to Myra. Myra was a practical woman, 62 years old, whose hands had the steady certainty of someone who had spent 4 decades rendering the world in ink, and who believed that the world was entirely renderable if you were precise enough and patient enough and willing to walk far enough. Myra would have told her that blank spaces were a failure of discipline, not a feature of the territory. Myra would not have been wrong exactly, but she also would not have been right. The blank space showed up in the third panel of the Northern Territories survey, which was what Sable was working on this particular morning in the long, ink-smelling room above Myra's workshop. It showed up in the same relative position it always did, not in any geographic location that corresponded to an actual place, but at the center of whatever she was drawing, as if the center of every map she made was the same center, regardless of what the map was nominally about. She had measured it once, precisely measured it, with the brass calipers that Myra kept hung on a nail by the eastern window. The blank space was always 4 inches wide and 2 inches tall, and its left edge was always positioned 17 inches from the left edge of whatever sheet she was working on, and its top edge was always 11 inches from the top. She had not told Myra about that measurement either. The compass on the edge of her drafting board was turning. Not dramatically, not spinning freely the way compasses spun when something disrupted the magnetic field, but oscillating, its needle making small, restless arcs, as if it could not quite commit to north. Sable had learned to read this as weather usually. When the needle was unsettled, something was coming, often a storm, sometimes something she could not name. She set down her pen and watched it. The needle settled. Not to north, not to any of the cardinal directions. It settled at a bearing of roughly 37 degrees east of north, pointing, as far as Sable could calculate from where she sat, at the road from the mountain pass. Sable, Myra's voice came up from the stairwell, dry and practical as always. Lord Castle's man is in the yard. Says the Alpha King's party will arrive by midday, and they want the Northern Territories survey ready for inspection. Sable looked at the blank space in panel 3 of the Northern Territories survey. She looked at the compass, which was still pointing 37 degrees east of north. The survey isn't finished, she called back. Lord Castle's man didn't say it had to be finished. He said it had to be ready for inspection, which I take to mean it has to exist and be visible and not actively catch fire when someone looks at it. A pause. Can it meet those requirements? It can meet those requirements. Then roll it up and bring it down. Sable rolled it up. She left the blank space in panel 3 where it was, because she had not yet figured out what belonged there, and because filling a blank space with the wrong thing was worse than leaving it empty. That was the first principle Myra had ever taught her, and it was the only principle she had never once violated. She carried the survey downstairs. The town of Thornwick was not large. It had 2 inns, a smithy, a market square that was actively a market only on the 1st and 3rd Tuesdays of each month, and the cartographer's workshop, which was the only reason anyone from outside the Northern Territories ever had reason to come here at all. Myra's maps were considered the authoritative rendering of everything north of the Graven Ridge, and Myra's maps were made here, in this long building with its ink smell, and its rows of completed surveys hanging from wooden racks, and its single apprentice who left blank spaces at the center of things. The Alpha King's party arrived at midday exactly. Sable was standing in the doorway of the workshop, holding the rolled survey, watching them come down the mountain road, and she felt the compass in her left coat pocket begin to turn before she saw them clearly enough to count heads. This was not unusual. The compass turned often. She had carried it in her pocket for 6 years, ever since she had found it in the bottom of a trunk that had belonged to her father, and it had never quite behaved the way compasses were supposed to behave. It responded to things that were not magnetic north. She had grown accustomed to this, the way you grew accustomed to any persistent irregularity in a tool you relied on. You noted it, you adjusted for it, you stopped expecting it to be otherwise. She was not prepared for it to stop. The Alpha King's party came around the last bend in the road. 6 riders, 2 flags graven black and silver. And at the front, on a gray horse that moved with the particular unhurried confidence of an animal that had never once been startled, a man who sat with the kind of stillness that Sable associated with very large things in nature. Mountains, old trees, river bends where the water went deep and quiet. The compass in her pocket went still. Not the unsettled oscillation it had been doing for the past hour, not the slow drift toward 37 degrees east of north it had settled into while she waited. Still, completely, absolutely still, as if it had found the thing it had been pointing at for the last 6 years and had simply stopped needing to search. Sable stood in the doorway of the workshop and held the rolled survey and felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up. The man on the gray horse looked at her. He was still 40 yards away. She could not have described his expression at that distance with any accuracy, but she knew he was looking at her, specifically at her, not at the building or the road or the mountain road ahead, the way she knew when a compass was pointing at something specific rather than drifting. With intention, with certainty. Sable, Myra appeared at her shoulder. "Close your mouth." Sable closed her mouth. She had not been aware that it was open. "That's the Alpha King," Myra said, in the tone she used when she was telling Sable a fact that she considered self-evident. "His name is Aldrich. He has been king for 11 years. He is here about the boundary survey, not about you. Roll down your sleeves, stand up straight, and try to look like someone who has completed at least 2/3 of the Northern Territories survey." "I've completed 4/5 of it," Sable said. "Then look like that." Myra stepped past her into the yard. "My lord." The Alpha King swung down from his horse. He was taller than she had estimated from 40 yards, which meant she was worse at estimating distance than she thought, which was a problem for a cartographer. He handed the gray horse's reins to one of his riders without looking. The horse accepted this with the same unhurried confidence it had been moving with for the past quarter mile, and he walked toward them, and the compass in Sable's pocket stayed completely still. "Myra," he had a voice like a map of terrain you had not expected to be mountainous level until it wasn't. "Thank you for receiving us." "Thank you for the advance notice," Myra said, which was her way of saying that 4 hours was not adequate advance notice, but she was choosing not to make a problem of it. "This is my apprentice, Sable. She has primary responsibility for the Northern Territories survey." He looked at her. Sable had been looked at before. She was 24 years old, and she had been Myra's apprentice for 10 years, and she had met border lords and trade representatives, and at least one very significant merchant from the eastern coast, who had sent his man ahead by 3 days to announce his importance. She knew what it felt like to be looked at by someone who was assessing you. This was not that. This was the look you gave something when you had been trying to find it for a very long time and had not entirely believed you would, and then you had, and now you were in the difficult position of not knowing what to do with that information. Sable recognized it because she had given things that look herself, usually when she found a landmark that confirmed she was where she thought she was. "Sable," the Alpha King said. "My lord," she held out the survey. It was not the full survey, it was 3 of the 5 panels, the ones she had completed, rolled together. I should tell you that panels 4 and 5 are still in progress. The ridge line east of Castle's border is disputed, and I won't mark it until I've walked it personally. You walk the terrain yourself, he said. I don't make maps of places I haven't been to, she said. It's Myra's first rule. He looked at the rolled survey in her hands. Something in his face, she could not read his face well at this distance, which was to say at a distance of approximately 6 feet, which suggested she was much worse at reading faces than she was at reading terrain, shifted slightly. That's an unusual rule for a cartographer, he said. Most cartographers work from other people's accounts, Myra said dryly, from slightly behind Sable's left shoulder. Sable doesn't trust accounts. She trusts her own feet. Also compasses, Sable said before she could stop herself, and elevation markers. The Alpha King looked at her for another moment. May I see the survey? She handed it to him. They spread the 3 completed panels across the long table in Myra's meeting room, which was the room she used when she had clients, which had good light and a table large enough to unroll even the largest surveys flat. Lord Castle's man, his name was Perth, a lean, efficient person who spoke in the abbreviated manner of someone who had spent too long relaying messages, stood on one side of the table. The Alpha King's second, a broad-shouldered man named Doran who had the particular quality of someone who was paying close attention to everything while appearing to be paying attention to nothing, stood on the other. Sable stood at the bottom of the table where the panels overlapped, and the survey was most technically complex, because that was where she was needed. The Alpha King stood beside her. This was a practical arrangement. She was the one who could explain the survey, and he was the one who needed it explained, and the logical thing was for them to stand near each other so that she could point at the relevant details without shouting across a table. Sable was a practical person. She understood practical arrangements. She did not understand why every time his arm came near hers, not touching, just near, the way arms were near each other when 2 people leaned over the same section of a map. Something in her chest went quiet and alert at the same time, the way the compass needle felt when it found its bearing. She explained the survey. She explained the ridge line that she had not yet walked. She explained the 3 different accounts she had received of where the boundary actually ran, and why all 3 of them were probably wrong, and what she intended to do about it as soon as the weather allowed her to make the eastern approach on foot. When do you intend to walk it? The Alpha King asked. 2 weeks if the weather holds. 3 if it doesn't. Lord Castle needs the boundary confirmed before the end of the month, Perth said, in the tone of someone reading from a list. Lord Castle can come walk the ridge himself, Sable said pleasantly, and see how fast he moves through ice melt runoff and loose shale at elevation. Doran the second made a sound that was almost certainly a suppressed laugh. Perth looked pained. The boundary can wait, the Alpha King said. Both Perth and Doran looked at him. Thornwick is on the Graven Road. We have 3 days before the council meeting. I'd like to see the 4th panel. It's a panel of incomplete survey, Sable said, primarily blank. I'd still like to see it. She looked at him. He was looking at the completed panels, specifically at the place where panels 2 and 3 overlapped, which was technically the most interesting section. The point where 3 different drainage systems converged and the contour lines became dense and complicated. Most clients looked at the borders. The borders were why they were here. The drainage systems were not what anyone had hired her to map. It's upstairs, she said. She brought panel 4 down. She had not intended to unroll it. Incomplete work was not meant to be shown, and this panel in particular had more blank space than finished line. But the Alpha King asked if he could see it unrolled, and she unrolled it, and then they were both standing at the side table looking at a map that was approximately 30% complete. The blank space at the center was there, as always. What's this? He pointed at it. A blank space, Sable said. I can see that. What's there in the territory? I don't know, that's why it's blank. You haven't walked it. I've walked the entire northern survey area, every inch of it. She paused. That particular location doesn't appear to correspond to any specific piece of ground. It's more of a cartographic blind spot. Something I can't seem to render. He was quiet for a moment. How long has it been blank? The question surprised her. It was not the question clients asked. Clients asked what the blank space meant for their borders, for their survey, for their administrative purposes. They did not ask how long it had been blank, because how long implied history, and blank spaces were not supposed to have history. It appears in all my work, she said carefully, in the same relative position. He looked at her. The room was smaller than the meeting room, and there was only one window, and the afternoon light was coming in at a low angle that put half his face in shadow. Sable could read terrain very well and faces poorly, but she could see, clearly enough, that whatever he was thinking, it was not about the survey. I need to tell you something, he said, and I want you to understand that I'm not telling you this to alarm you or to make any kind of claim on you. I'm telling you because it's true and because I think you deserve to know it. Sable set down the pen she was holding. Go on, she said. My wolf, his name is Meridian, has been pointing east for 4 years. She looked at him. Not constantly, he said, the way a compass sometimes points at something that isn't north. He has been oriented east for 4 years, and I have not been able to find what he was pointing at. And yesterday, when we came down the mountain road and I saw you standing in the doorway of this building, he stopped pointing. The compass in Sable's pocket was very, very still. He stopped, the Alpha King said, because he had found it. The room was quiet. Somewhere in the building below them, she could hear Myra moving around, the particular sound of someone who was moving with deliberate loudness to signal that they were not listening. I'm not a wolf, Sable said. I don't have a pack. I know. I don't know anything about how this works, the bond. The what you're describing. I know that too. Then why are you telling me? Because, he said simply, the blank space in your maps corresponds to a location in my territory that my pack elders have been calling a boundary point for 2 generations. And because your compass, which you have been carrying in your left pocket since we came into this room and which I have been watching, has not moved once since I walked through the door of this building. He paused. I noticed things. Sable put her hand in her pocket. The compass was still. It had been still for the better part of 3 hours now, which was, she calculated, trying to be objective, something that had never happened in 6 years of carrying it. What does the blank space mean? She asked. In your territory. What do the pack elders say is at that boundary point? The center, he said. They call it the center. They've had a prophecy for 2 generations that says the king's line will find its mate when someone from outside the pack draws a map and leaves the center blank. He paused. I should tell you that I have not believed in this prophecy for 11 years. What changed? You, he said. Part 2, the boundary walk. She did not say yes. She was not being asked to say yes to anything in particular. He had not made a proposal, had not used any of the words she associated with the mate bond from the fragments she'd heard in market gossip and travelers' talk. He had told her the truth. He had given her the information and stepped back from it. And when Doran knocked on the door of the side room to remind him that there were practical matters to attend to, he had gone and left the incomplete panel 4 unrolled on the side table. Sable stood and looked at the blank space. She thought about the compass. She thought about the way Meridian, his wolf, 4 years of pointing east, had stopped when she was found. She rolled up panel 4. She carried it back upstairs. She sat down at her drafting board and she looked at the blank space in panel 3 for a long time, and she thought about the first principle Myra had taught her. Don't fill a blank space with the wrong thing. Wait until you know what belongs there. She didn't know yet, but she was beginning to suspect. Myra came upstairs at some point in the late afternoon, carrying 2 cups of tea, and wearing the expression she wore when she had decided to be diplomatic rather than direct, which meant she had decided the situation was complicated enough to require diplomatic handling. "Well," Myra said. "Don't," Sable said. "I wasn't going to say anything. You were going to say that, in your professional opinion, as a woman who has been making maps of the Northern Territories for 40 years, the blank space was always going to turn out to be something, and you were just waiting for me to figure out what." Myra set down one of the cups of tea on the corner of the drafting board. "I was going to say that he sent a very courteous message asking if you'd be willing to walk the Eastern Ridge with him the day after tomorrow, and that I've written back on your behalf saying yes, on the grounds that the boundary survey needs to be completed, and his presence will presumably expedite the Lord's cooperation." Sable looked at her. "You sent a reply on my behalf. I'm your employer and your guardian for purposes of professional communication. It falls within my remit." Myra sat down in the chair by the window that she never used for anything except sitting in when she had something to say. "Sable, that compass has been turning for 6 years. I know. It's not turning now. I know that too. You've been leaving blank spaces at the center of your maps for as long as I've been teaching you. You've never been able to tell me what should go there." Sable picked up her pen, set it down again. "He said his wolf had been pointing east for 4 years. Yes. I'm not a wolf." "No," Myra agreed. "You're a cartographer's apprentice from Thornwick with no pack and a compass that doesn't behave and a persistent tendency to leave blank spaces in your work. You're also 24 years old and you've been pointing at something for your entire adult life and not knowing what it was." She picked up her tea. "I'm not telling you what to do. I'm telling you that I wrote back and said yes to the boundary walk, and that whatever you decide after that is your decision, and that the tea will get cold." Sable picked up her tea. They sat for a while, and the light through the window went from gold to gray, and the compass in Sable's pocket stayed still. He came to the workshop the next morning. Not officially, he sent no message ahead, made no request. She simply looked up from her drafting board at mid-morning and saw him standing in the doorway of the workroom, which opened onto the street, and which she generally left open in good weather because the ventilation improved the quality of the inkwork. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said. "You're not interrupting anything important." This was true. She was re-inking a boundary line that had smudged, which was tedious but not requiring concentration. He stepped inside. He was dressed more practically than the day before, no formal graving colors, just the traveling clothes of someone who was planning to walk somewhere. He looked at the rows of surveys hanging from the racks, and at the tools arranged along the north wall, and at the drafting board, with the focused attention he had given the maps the day before. "May I ask you something?" "You may," she said. "The compass. When did you first notice it wasn't behaving normally?" She thought about it. "The second week after I found it. I was surveying the south edge of the castle lowlands, and the needle kept pulling toward the northeast, and there was nothing in the northeast except the road to graving. I thought it was a manufacturing defect. But you kept using it. It was accurate everywhere except northeast. A compass that's accurate in 4 out of 5 directions is still a useful compass." She paused. "Also, it had belonged to my father. I didn't want to get rid of it." He was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the wall of surveys, and she studied his profile with the same attention she gave to terrain she was trying to understand. The way the light fell across it, the elevation changes, the places where the surface gave away something about what was underneath. "My father died when I was 19, he said. "I'd been king for about 3 hours when the pointing started. Meridian pulling east. I thought it was grief at first. some kind of displacement. But it wasn't. No, he turned from the wall of surveys. It kept going, and it got more specific over time, more precise, like a survey getting refined as you get closer to the territory. Sable thought about that. The blank space got smaller, she said. He looked at her. In my maps, over the last 3 years or so, the blank space has been getting smaller, not disappearing, still present, still in the same relative position, but contracting, as if whatever was there was becoming more defined. Yes, he said, exactly like that. They looked at each other. The compass in her pocket was still very still. I want to tell you, Sable said carefully, that I'm not afraid of this. I'm not treating this as something that has to be feared or avoided. I'm treating it as data that I don't yet have a complete map for, and I don't fill blank spaces until I know what belongs there. I know, he said. Myra told me that was your first principle. Myra talks too much. Something shifted in his face. She was getting better at reading it, she thought, or she was getting used to the terrain of it, which was the same thing. She told me your first principle. She also told me that you've never violated it once in 10 years of apprenticeship. Also true. Then I'll wait, he said, until you know what belongs there. She looked at him for a moment. You're a king, she said. You have a council meeting in 3 days. You have 2 border lords who need a boundary confirmed. You have a territory the size of, as she gestured at the wall of surveys, which included 3 separate panels of graving territory. That. Yes. Do kings generally wait? This one does, he said, when the thing he's waiting for is worth the waiting. They walked the eastern ridge on the 2nd day. Doran came with them, and Perith, and 2 of the Alpha King's riders who moved with the particular quiet alertness of people whose job it was to ensure that nothing dangerous happened while remaining invisible. Myra had packed Sable's surveying kit, the portable compass mount, the sighting scope, the field notebook with its oilskin cover, and had told her to observe, record, and not make any decisions at elevation that she wouldn't make at sea level. Sable had told her she'd never been to sea level, and didn't know what the standard was. Myra had told her to use her judgment. The ridge was, as she had anticipated, complicated. The ice melt runoff had created a series of temporary watercourses that would not be present in summer, and the shale deposits in the upper section made 3 of the landmark positions she'd planned to use for triangulation unreliable. She had to improvise, which she was good at. She moved along the ridge line with the sighting scope and took measurements while Doran and the riders maintained a patient and watchful perimeter, and Perith made notes, and the Alpha King followed her. He was good at this, she discovered. Good at moving through rough terrain without making noise, without creating problems, without needing to be told where to put his feet. He moved the way large things in nature moved, like water finding the path, or a wind adjusting around an obstacle. And when she stopped to take a measurement, he stopped too, out of her eyeline, giving her the space she needed. Hold this, she said at one point, passing him the other end of the measuring line without looking. He held it. Now back up 3 paces. He backed up 3 paces. Hold. He held. She took the measurement. She wrote it in her field notebook. She moved on to the next triangulation point, and he followed, and she passed him the measuring line again without ceremony, and he took it, and they did this for approximately 2 hours along the upper ridge. Doran, from some distance behind them, made several sounds that Sable was fairly sure were suppressed commentary. She ignored this. At the point where the ridge crested and the view opened up, the northern territories falling away to the east, the Graven Valley to the west, the sky immense in all directions. She stopped and took out her compass and held it flat on her palm and watched it. Still? Is it still still? The Alpha King asked from beside her. Yes. Meridian 2, he said this quietly as a simple report. When you're near, he's been still since the road. She looked out at the territory below them. She was good at reading terrain, and she was looking at a very large piece of territory, and she was thinking about what it would mean to draw a map of it, not just the geography, but the other things a map could hold if you were willing to let it. The history, the paths between things, the places where different kinds of land met. "Tell me about the prophecy," she said. "The whole thing, not just the part about the blank space." He was quiet for a moment. "Old Wren, she's a pack elder. She holds the old texts. The prophecy says that the king's line will reach its completion when a map maker from outside the pack world leaves the center of a map blank, because she doesn't know what belongs there yet. And when she does know, what belongs there will be the same thing that has always belonged there." Sable thought about this. What does that mean? What has always belonged there? Old Wren says it means the bond, the mate bond that the king's wolf has been pointing toward, that the blank space and the pointing are the same thing, two ends of the same line, searching for each other. The wind moved across the ridge. Below them, the northern territories went on for as far as she could see. "I've been pointing at something since I found the compass," Sable said. "Since the first week after I started carrying it. I didn't know what. I assumed it was a direction, a place I needed to go." "Not a place," he said. She turned and looked at him. He was looking out at the same view she'd been looking at, but the quality of his attention had shifted, the way terrain shifted when you understood a different principle of its formation. He was not looking at the territory. He was waiting. "Not a place," she agreed. The compass in her palm turned the first time in 2 days and pointed directly at him, for one very clear moment, and then it went back to being still. She watched it for a moment. "I'm not saying yes to anything yet," she said. "I'm saying that I understand what the blank space might be, and that I want more time to think about it." "That's enough," he said. "It might take a while." "I've been waiting 4 years, the Alpha King said. "I can wait for thinking." Part 3, The Pack. They returned to Thornwick that evening. The council meeting was the following morning, and the Alpha King's party would travel to the Graven Hall for it, and the boundary survey, the eastern ridge having been walked and measured and partially rendered in Sable's field notebook, would take another week at minimum to complete and ink properly. She expected him to leave. He sent a message, through Doran, asking if he might impose on the workshop for one more day before the council meeting. Myra wrote back, in Sable's name again, that this was not an imposition. He came in the morning. He brought bread from the inn where his party was staying, good bread, the kind with a hard crust and a dense, slightly sour interior that suggested someone at the inn knew what they were doing. And he knocked on the open door of the workroom, and held up the bread in a gesture that was endearingly tentative for someone who was, as far as Sable understood, the ruler of approximately 300,000 people. "May I come in?" She was inking the eastern ridge measurements from her field notebook. "You may. Set the bread on the side table." He set the bread on the side table. He sat in the chair in the corner, the chair that nobody sat in, that Myra had put there for clients who needed somewhere to be, while the cartographer finished something, and he watched her work. She expected this to be uncomfortable. People watching her work was usually uncomfortable. She had a tendency, when observed, to become overly precise, second-guessing measurements she trusted and rechecking lines she knew were right. She did not second-guess anything while he watched. She worked. He was quiet in the corner. At some point she became aware that she had been working for approximately 2 hours without once wondering whether someone was there, which was, she stopped and thought about this, very unusual. She was almost always aware of where people were in relation to her. She had a cartographer's instinct for occupying the same space as things, for knowing where the bodies were in a room. She had stopped knowing he was there, because she had stopped processing his presence as something separate from her own. She set down her pen. "That's a strange feeling," she said. "What is?" You've been sitting there for 2 hours and I forgot you were there. Not because you were quiet, I forget quiet things sometimes. Because you stopped feeling like a separate thing. He was very still in the corner. Yes, he said. Is that the bond? Partly it's just, he paused. Meridian says this is how it's supposed to feel. He says the pointing is the absence. The stillness is the presence. She thought about that for a moment. I want to see Graven, she said. Before I make any decisions, I want to see the territory and meet the people I'd be. She stopped. I want to make an informed decision. I'm a cartographer. I don't mark territory I haven't surveyed. When could you leave? The survey needs a week to complete and ink. After that, I could leave. I can wait a week, he said. She looked at him. You have a council meeting tomorrow. And then I'll come back. That's a 2-day ride. Yes. She picked up her pen. She looked at the Eastern Ridge measurements. You don't have to come back. You could send a rider. I know, he said. She thought about not saying the next thing. It was the kind of thing that was safer not to say. That was more comfortable to leave implied. That fell into the category of blank space that you didn't fill until you knew what belonged there. But she had always been bad at leaving things blank that she already knew the answer to. I'd rather you came back, she said, than a rider. The quality of the quiet in the corner changed. Then I'll come back, he said. He left for the council meeting at mid-morning. Doran paused at the door to give her a look that contained several entire paragraphs of communication, all of which seemed to amount to something like thank you and also good luck, and also my lord has not been easy to live with for 4 years, and then he left too. Myra came up from the workshop. Well, she said. Don't, Sable said. I'm not saying anything. You're saying something with your face. My face is saying that the Eastern Ridge measurements look good and the Fenham boundary line is going to need a second check before you ink it. Myra sat in the chair in the corner where the Alpha King had been sitting, and looked at the panel in progress. The bread was good. It was good bread. He asked the innkeeper about it specifically. Marta told me. He asked what kind of bread you liked. Sable set down her pen. He did not. He did. He asked if you had a preference for the seeded crust or the plain crust. I prefer the seeded crust. I know, the bread he brought had a seeded crust. Myra's tone was completely neutral. Just something I noticed. Sable looked at the Fenham boundary line. It did need a second check. She checked it. He came back in a week, as he'd said he would. He came back in 6 days, actually, which meant the council meeting had either gone very quickly or he had pushed the return ride. He sent a message ahead this time, and the message said only, Survey complete. A. She wrote back, Survey complete. Fenham boundary confirmed, panel 4 inked. Sable. He arrived the following morning, and she met him at the door of the workshop with the rolled survey and the field notebook. And she handed both to him without ceremony, and he looked at her for a moment, and then at the materials in his hands. I'm ready, she said, to see Graven. If the offer stands. The offer stands, he said. Myra came out behind her. I've packed her kit. She has the portable compass mount and the field notebook and the oilskin case. I've also packed 3 changes of clothes, which she would not have done herself, and a letter of professional introduction for the Graven record, in case anyone asks why she's there. The Alpha King looked at Myra. Thank you. She's my apprentice, Myra said. I expect her back when she's finished surveying, which is to say when she's finished deciding, and I expect her to be treated as a professional in good standing and not as anyone's property. She will be, he said. Something in his voice was very serious. The way the river was serious when it was deep and running fast, you could hear it if you listened. I give you my word. Good, Myra patted Sable on the shoulder. Go draw some maps. Part 4, GREYVNE hold. Graving was larger than she had mapped it. This was technically her own fault. She had mapped it from the outside, from the approach roads and the ridge surveys and the territorial accounts, and maps of the exterior of a thing were always incomplete because they didn't account for the way a place felt from the inside. The hold itself was stone, very old stone, the kind that had been here long enough to have its own weather system, its own microclimate of drafts and warm patches and places where the light collected in ways the architecture didn't entirely explain. The people were watching. She had expected this. She was an outsider and a human, and she had come with the Alpha King, and packs were cautious creatures. She had gathered from the travelers' talk she'd heard over the years. They watched her the way she watched new terrain with careful attention, assessing what kind of ground it was. Doran introduced her to the people who needed to be introduced to, the senior council, the household staff, Old Wren, and she greeted them with the same practical courtesy she gave to Lord Castle's surveyors and Lord Fenham's border officials, which was to say the courtesy of someone who was there to do a specific professional job and would appreciate being treated as competent. Old Wren was 90 approximately, and had the particular quality of very old things that had survived long enough to have stopped worrying. She looked at Sable for a long time without speaking, and then she said, "Show me." "Show you what?" "Your compass." Sable took it out of her pocket. She laid it flat on her palm and held it out. Old Wren looked at it for a long time. The needle was still. "Where does it usually point?" Old Wren asked. "Northeast," Sable said, "most of the time toward Graving." Old Wren made a sound that was probably satisfaction. "And now?" "Now it doesn't point at anything. It's been still since I arrived at Thornwick and he walked through the door." Old Wren looked at her for another long moment. "The old text says she will come with the center blank," she said. "Not because she doesn't see, but because she knows not to fill a thing until she understands what belongs there. Myra taught me that." "Your Myra is a wise woman." Old Wren handed the compass back. "The center has been blank in this pack story for 2 generations. Your king has been walking toward it for 4 years, and you have been drawing toward it for 6. She paused. "I'm not telling you to do anything. I'm telling you that the stories match." Sable pocketed the compass. "The stories matching doesn't mean the person is right for the role." "No," Old Wren agreed, "but it's a good beginning." She stayed for 3 weeks. She told herself it was for the maps. There were things to survey. Graven's western approach hadn't been properly rendered in any of Myra's work, and there were 2 tributary systems east of the hold that she had flagged in her field notebook as requiring on-site measurement. These were legitimate cartographic projects. She worked on them every morning, taking her kit and her field notebook and going out into the Graving territory while the hold was still quiet. She stopped telling herself this after the first week. What she was actually doing was learning the territory. Not geographically, she was doing that too, but that was secondary. She was learning the people, the rhythms of the hold, the way the council worked, the way Doran managed the daily logistics of a king's household with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been doing it long enough to have stopped thinking about it. She was learning the pack. She watched the Alpha King. He was good at his work. She had not expected to care about this, but she found that she cared about it very much, the same way she cared about precision in a survey, the way it mattered whether a person who held authority was precise in their use of it. He was. He listened more than he spoke in the council sessions she was allowed to observe. He pushed back when he disagreed, not loudly, but with the specific kind of clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. He remembered things, names, contexts, the particular concerns of individual council members, with the same comprehensive accuracy that she brought to remembering the contours of terrain she had walked. He was also, she observed over several mornings, someone who got up before the hold was fully awake and walked the perimeter of the outer wall with Meridian, or with what she understood to be the wolf state, the part of him that pointed and was still in the early light. Not on watch, not on patrol, just walking. She was on the north wall one morning with her sighting scope, measuring the elevation of the western approach for her survey, when she saw him below on the outer path. He looked up. She waved slightly, with the hand that wasn't holding the scope. He raised a hand in return. She went back to her measurement. The compass in her pocket was completely still. She walked into the council session on the 17th day and said, in front of Doran and the senior council and the two border lords who had apparently come to discuss the same boundary survey that had started all of this, "The blank space at the center of my maps is the mate bond." The council room went quiet. "I've been leaving it blank," she said, "because I'm trained not to fill a space until I know what belongs there. Now I know what belongs there." She looked at the Alpha King. "I'm not doing this because of the prophecy. The prophecy is useful as context, the way an old account is useful when you're trying to understand terrain. It gives you a frame of reference, not a final answer. I'm doing this because I've spent 3 weeks surveying this territory and its people and its king, and my professional assessment is that this is sound ground." The council was very quiet. Lord Castle cleared his throat. "Does this mean the boundary survey is settled?" he asked. "The boundary survey has been settled for 2 weeks, Sable said. "The Eastern Ridge line is confirmed and inked. Doran has a copy." Doran held up a rolled survey. "Good," said Lord Castle, who appeared to consider this the primary matter at hand. The Alpha King was looking at her. She had gotten very good at reading his face over 17 days, which was the same as getting very good at reading terrain you'd surveyed repeatedly. The landmarks became familiar, the elevation changes predictable, the places where the light fell differently easily recognized. His face said, "You're sure?" She looked back at him. "Yes." Part 5, the center. There was a ceremony. There were, it turned out, several ceremonies. The wolf ceremony, which involved the pack acknowledging the bond in the way packs acknowledged bonds, which she was told about in advance by Doran in the practical tones of someone who wanted her to have accurate expectations. And the hold ceremony, which was the formal recognition of a new presence in the pack's leadership, and which involved a great deal of standing in a specific place while people made specific statements in a specific order. Sable stood in the specific place and listened to the specific statements and watched the pack, because she was a surveyor, and she surveyed things even when she was technically the thing being surveyed. She watched them watching her. The careful attention of the first week had shifted. She could not pinpoint precisely when it had shifted. Sometime in the second week, she thought, after she had fixed the council chamber's window latch, which had been sticking, using a pen knife and 3 minutes of focused attention. Or possibly after she had pointed out to Doran, very quietly, that the Eastern Trade account had a 20-count error in its third column, which had been propagating through the quarterly records for approximately 8 months. Or possibly after she had produced, during an outdoor meal that had been overtaken by a sudden rain, a large oilskin sheet from her surveying kit, and deployed it as a temporary shelter with the calm efficiency of someone for whom unexpected weather was simply a data point to be incorporated into the plan. The careful attention had become something warmer. Not full acceptance. She did not expect full acceptance to be quick, and she would not have trusted it if it was but the beginning of something. A tentative mapping. We don't fully know this terrain yet, but we're learning its features. She understood this. It was where she was herself. The Alpha King came to find her afterward, when the ceremonies were done, and the hold was quiet. She was on the north wall again. It had become her habitual observation point, the place she went when she needed to look at the territory and think. And he came up the stairs and stood beside her the way he'd stood beside her on the Eastern Ridge, giving her the space she needed. "How are you?" he said. "Good," she considered this. "Better than good. I'm trying to figure out how to map this." "Map what?" "This." She gestured loosely at the territory, at the hold, at herself somewhat. It doesn't fit the conventions. It's not geographic territory. It doesn't have elevation markers and triangulation points and boundary lines that can be confirmed by walk measurement. No, he agreed. But it has the same quality, she said slowly, as territory that you understand. When you've walked the ground and surveyed it carefully and you understand the drainage patterns and where the runoff goes and where the solid rock is under the surface, there's a feeling you get, of knowing the ground under your feet. She paused. I feel that here. He was quiet beside her. He had the quality, in the quiet, of something very large and very certain. Not the certainty of something that insisted on being correct, but the certainty of something that had been standing in the same place for a very long time and had no intention of moving. Old Wren told me last week, he said, that the prophecy doesn't say the blank space gets filled. It says the center gets known. She looked at him. That's different, she said. She says they're different. Known is not the same as rendered. You can know something without being able to put it fully into ink. Sable thought about this for a long time. Beside her, the hold was quiet, and the territory below the north wall was going gold in the late light, and the compass in her pocket was completely, perfectly still. I've been trying to render it, she said finally. That's the wrong approach. I've been trying to make it a map. What should you be making it instead? She thought about this too. A home, she said. The word sat there between them, very simple and very precise, the way the best words were, the ones that were the exactly right tool for the thing you needed to describe, neither larger nor smaller than the truth. He looked at her, she looked back at him. Yes, he said. Part 6, What the Center Holds. She sent a letter to Myra. The letter said, among other things, that she had completed the preliminary survey of the Graving Western approach and was planning to return to Thornwick in the next month to complete the inked version, and that she had accepted a role at Graving Hold in an official capacity as the pack's cartographer, and that she would need her surveying kit shipped when Myra could arrange it, along with the reference files for the Northern Territories survey. The letter also said that the blank space in her maps was gone. She had sat down with panel 4, she had brought it with her, carefully rolled and protected in the oilskin case, on the evening after the ceremony, and she had looked at it for a long time, and she had picked up her pen, and she had drawn in the blank space at the center the symbol she used in all her surveys for a primary settlement, for the center of a territory, for the place that everything else was oriented toward. It was a small symbol, 2 converging lines meeting at a point. She had never been able to put it there before. Now she could. Myra wrote back in 3 days. The writer had gone fast, or Myra had written immediately, or both. The letter was brief. It said, I always knew the blank space was not geography. I'm glad you know what it is now. The survey files will arrive by the end of the month. The seeded bread is harder to come by here without you to justify it. Myra. Sable folded the letter and put it in her field notebook, where she kept things that needed to be preserved. She settled into the shape of Graven. This was the only way she knew to describe it. She didn't move in quickly or establish herself with declarations. She surveyed, the way she had always surveyed, by walking the ground carefully and paying attention to what was actually there, not what she expected. She walked the pack's territory. She learned the names and functions of the buildings and the people. She attended council sessions and said almost nothing in the first month, and a moderate amount in the second, and by the 3rd month she had worked out which problems she was positioned to help with, the ones that required the specific combination of spatial reasoning and systematic attention that she had spent her whole professional life developing. The eastern boundary situation was resolved by the end of the 1st month, because she produced a map that made the disputed sections unambiguous by incorporating 3 separate historical accounts with her own survey measurements, and Lord Fenham accepted it, and Lord Castle accepted it, and Perth wrote her a brief, gratified message saying that this had saved everyone approximately 6 months of ongoing dispute. The Western Approach Survey became a working document for the PAC's infrastructure planning. She walked it 3 times in different weather and produced a set of maps that allowed the council to understand, for the first time, precisely where the drainage problems in the lower approach originated and what could be done about them. She redrew the holding map, not because the original was wrong, but because it was 20 years old and the territory had changed in ways that the map didn't reflect, and a map that didn't reflect the territory it was supposed to represent was just a pretty piece of paper. She drew it carefully and completely. At the center, she marked the hold itself, the primary settlement, the point that everything else oriented toward with the converging line symbol. She hung it in the council chamber. The ceremony that old Wren called the full bond was held in the 4th month, in the garden where the winter had finally released its hold, and the first green was coming up through the thawed ground. It was not a large ceremony. It was the pack, and the council and Myra, who had made the ride from Thornwick with the surveying files and had then refused to leave until she had seen the ceremony, which she described as a professional courtesy. The Alpha King, Aldrich, she called him now, which she had been calling him for 2 months, which still occasionally felt like a word she was using for the first time even when it wasn't, stood beside her in the garden, and old Wren spoke the words, and the pack was quiet all around them. Sable had her compass in her pocket. She could feel, without taking it out, that it was still. She hadn't needed to check it since the road to Thornwick, but she was a cartographer, and a cartographer checked their instruments even when they were confident of the reading. She checked it now. Still, absolutely, completely, finally still. Not the stillness of something that had stopped searching, but the stillness of something that had arrived. The difference was almost impossible to put into words, and she had been trying in the evenings in the field notebook she kept for observations that were not cartographic. The closest she had gotten was this: the compass pointing is the absence, the compass still is the presence. Everything I was oriented toward, I have now arrived at. The spring garden was very quiet. Beside her, Aldrich was steady and warm in the way old stone was warm when it had been sitting in the sun, not heated quickly, not easily cooled, deeply and durably warm. Meridian, she had come to understand, was the word for the part of him that had been pointing east for 4 years. The part that had known, when she couldn't know yet, what was at the other end of the compass bearing. Meridian had been patient. She had always thought patience was a virtue she possessed naturally, but Meridian's patience had been something else, something more than virtue, something closer to understanding that the right thing would arrive when it was ready and not before. Old Wren said the last of the words. Sable looked at Aldrich, he looked at her. The center, he said. The center, she agreed. The green was coming up through the garden around them, and the pack was present and warm and watchful, and the compass in her pocket was still. Epilogue: the maps. The Northern Territories survey was completed and bound in the autumn of their first year. Myra came to Graven for the binding. She was making the trip more often now, which she attributed to the need to review Sable's work, and which everyone understood was because Graven Hold had, against all reasonable expectation, become a place that Myra wanted to be. She and old Wren had developed what Sable could only describe as a profoundly opinionated friendship, built on a shared conviction that most people used more words than necessary and fewer precise measurements than required. The bound survey was presented to the council, all 5 panels complete. The eastern ridge confirmed, the Fenham and Castle boundaries marked, the drainage systems annotated, the approach roads measured. Panel 4 was the one people looked at longest. The center mark, the converging line symbol, drawn there on the night of the ceremony, small and precise and final, was the first thing the eye found when you unrolled it. What's at the center? Lord Castle asked, squinting at the symbol. The hold, Sable said. I can see it's the hold symbol, but you've marked it differently from the standard territorial center notation. Yes. Why? She thought about this. Because the standard notation is for a geographic center, she said. This is for a different kind of center, one that takes longer to survey and is harder to render accurately but is no less real for that. Lord Castle considered this. He was a practical man. He had been content with the confirmed boundary line and had not required further explanation of anything since. He looked at the center mark. Does it correspond to anything that will be administratively relevant? He asked. Yes, Sable said. Everything is administratively relevant to the center. That's what a center is. Lord Castle nodded, in the manner of someone who had decided to accept an answer that he did not fully understand on the grounds that the person giving it clearly did. The survey was filed in the Graving Records. A copy went to the Territorial Archive in the Northern Territories Administrative Center. A copy went to Myra's workshop, where she hung it on the rack with the other completed surveys, in the place of honor she gave to the work she considered most significant. She hung it the center-down way, so that the converging line symbol was at the bottom of the rack, pointing downward, the way a compass points when it has found its north. Some years later, someone asked Sable, a young surveyor, newly arrived from the Eastern Territories, who was working on the expansion maps of the Graven Outer Grounds, how she had known. How she had been sure enough to leave the blank space blank for years, when most cartographers would have filled it with something, anything, just to have it complete. Sable thought about this for a while. The first principle, she said finally, is that you don't fill a blank space until you know what belongs there. That's the discipline part, the not filling. But the first principle also assumes that eventually you will know, that the knowing is possible, that the space isn't permanently blank, just not yet known. The young surveyor thought about this, and the center. The center was always there, Sable said. I just didn't know what to call it yet. She was standing in the holding garden when she said this, which was the garden where the spring had come in and old Wren had spoken the words and Aldrich had said the center, and she had said the center back. The garden was in full summer now, which it had been in full summer for many years, and the compass in her pocket was still, had been still, unremarkably, completely, the way a compass is still when it is no longer searching, for longer than she could precisely remember. She did not need to check it. She knew where she was. End. Word count target, ~21, 000 words duration, ~120 minutes at ~175 WPM. Expansion section A, insert after. They spread the 3 completed panels across the long table. The northern panel was the one she was most proud of. It was also the one that was going to cause the most trouble, because the northern panel included the section of the Fen engraving border that had been under administrative dispute for 11 years, and the dispute was not at its core about where the line actually ran. She knew where the line actually ran. She had measured it, but about what it meant for 3 different sets of water rights, and water rights were a problem that maps solved slowly. She explained this to the Alpha King. She explained it in the direct, specific way. She explained things to clients when the clients needed to understand the problem rather than just the solution, because solutions to problems that weren't understood tended to stop working the moment they were no longer actively maintained. He listened to all of it. He did not interrupt, which was unusual in her experience of clients. He asked 2 questions, the first about the upstream drainage that was driving the water rights dispute, and the second about the historical position of the boundary before the dispute had started. Both were exactly the right questions. She answered them. He looked at the section of the panel she indicated, and he was quiet for a moment. "You've shown the old survey line," he said. "In lighter ink. I mark contested historical boundaries in the lighter weight. It's part of the notation system. And the 3 accounts you mentioned, the 3 different positions people have put the boundary at, are any of them on this panel?" She leaned over and pointed. The current administrative line, that's the heavy black. Lord Fenham's claim is the lighter line running northeast of it. The village account places it southwest, which you can see here. She traced the line. None of them agree with each other. None of them agree with the physical watershed. Where's the watershed? She pointed. He looked at it for a long time. That's Lord Castle's side of the current line. By approximately 40 yards, yes. And the watershed is the legally governing factor under the Northern Territory's water compact. She had not expected him to know this. She had been prepared to explain it. Yes. Then the boundary should run at the watershed, and Fenham has been using water that isn't his for 11 years. And the solution is a new survey that clearly establishes the watershed line and is accepted by both lords as binding. She straightened up, which is what I'm doing. But it requires walking the ground, and the disputed ground is the eastern ridge, and I won't ink a line I haven't walked. He looked at her with the same expression he'd been giving her since the road, the one that was not assessment exactly, but something more specific than that. Something that had the quality of recognition. When can you walk it? 2 weeks if the weather holds. I want to walk it with you, he said. She looked at him. I need to understand the territory, he said. It was not quite a justification. It was a statement of a thing that was true, and that happened to be convenient. I should have walked that ridge 3 years ago. It's difficult ground, she said. I smelt runoff, loose shale above the tree line. I've walked worse. She thought about arguing. She thought about the professional standards around client participation in field surveys, which generally ran toward keeping clients at a safe distance and relying on her accounts rather than their presence. She thought about the compass in her left pocket, which had been pointing toward him since the moment he walked into the building. You can carry the measuring line, she said. Expansion Section B, the evening before the boundary walk, Sable's private reflection. She sat in her room at Myra's house, the small room above the workshop where she'd slept since she was 14, with its single window facing north and its shelf of field notebooks, and its smell of ink that had soaked into the plaster over 10 years. And she thought about the compass. She had thought about the compass before, many times. She had thought about it scientifically. She had no evidence that it was doing anything other than being a defective instrument that happened to consistently fail in one specific direction. She had thought about it practically. She adjusted for its deviation when she was working in the northeast quadrant, the same way she adjusted for any instrument variation, and her work was none the worse for it. She had thought about it philosophically, late at night, in the way she thought about the blank space in her maps, as a question she was carrying without expecting an immediate answer. She had not thought about it the way she was thinking about it now. The compass pointed northeast, had pointed northeast for 6 years. She had always assumed that meant something geographic, a place, a bearing, a terrain feature she had not yet identified. She had assumed it was a cartographic problem because cartography was her framework and she brought it to everything. It had not occurred to her that it was pointing at a person. Or it had occurred to her vaguely, the way improbable hypotheses occurred to you when you were running out of more probable ones. But she had set it aside because it required assumptions she didn't know how to make. She didn't know anything about mate bonds. She didn't know anything about wolves or packs or the biological and spiritual mechanics of whatever it was that made one wolf orient itself toward a specific unknown person for years and years and years. She knew about compasses. She knew about blank spaces. She took the compass out of her pocket and held it flat on her palm and looked at it. It was not pointing northeast. It was still, completely still, the needle resting at an orientation that was almost magnetic north but not quite, more like north, but slightly east and very settled, the way a compass settled when everything was aligned and there was no confusion about direction. She thought meridian, 4 years pointing east. She thought 6 years pointing northeast. She thought from Thornwick to Graven was roughly 37 degrees east of north. She set the compass down on the windowsill and looked at it for a while. Then she picked up her field notebook and wrote, in the small precise script she used for survey notes rather than the slightly looser script she used for personal observations. Query: is the blank space at the center of all maps I produce a cartographic problem, or is it a bearing problem? A blank space is what you have when you don't know what belongs in a location. A bearing is a direction towards something you haven't yet reached. The blank space appears in the same relative location in every map I produce, regardless of geographic context. It does not correspond to any geographic location. It corresponds to a relative position. The relative position is, at the center, equidistant from all edges. She stopped writing. She looked at the compass. The center. Old Wren says this is what the pack elders have called it for 2 generations. The center of the king's territory. The center of the mate bond. The place that everything else is oriented toward. She had been leaving the center blank for 10 years. She had been pointing toward the center for 6. She wrote one more line, not a geographic problem, not a cartographic problem, a navigation problem. I have been performing the outward gestures of navigation, compass, field notebook, survey lines, without knowing what I was navigating toward. She closed the notebook. She looked at the compass, still and pointing slightly east of north, resting on the windowsill. Tomorrow she would walk the eastern ridge. She would carry the measuring line and take the triangulation readings and record the shale deposit positions and confirm the watershed location by on-site measurement. She would do all of this carefully and correctly, because it was her profession, and she did her profession carefully and correctly regardless of other circumstances. And the Alpha King would be there, carrying the other end of the measuring line. And Meridian would be still. She put the compass back in her pocket. She opened her field notebook to a new page. She wrote at the top, "Things I know to be true." And then she wrote, 1. The compass is accurate. 2. I don't fill blank spaces until I know what belongs there. 3. I am beginning to know. She closed the notebook. She slept. Expansion Section C, Extended Ridge Walk Scene. The triangulation took longer than she had planned, because the ice melt runoff had created a temporary watercourse across her 3rd measurement point, and she had to relocate it, which required her to recalculate the entire triangulation network from the relocated point. This was not a crisis. Cartographic fieldwork required exactly this kind of real-time adjustment, and she had long since developed the mental flexibility to re-anchor a survey network when conditions changed, but it took time. The Alpha King waited while she recalculated. He held the measuring line. He was patient in the way that she was starting to understand, working beside him for the first time, was not the patience of someone who was waiting for something to be over, but the patience of someone who was genuinely interested in the process and would be content to be here for as long as the process required. "You're re-anchoring from this rock," he said at one point, watching her work. "The original 3rd point is under runoff. I need a new fixed reference. The outcrop 3 meters to your left is older bedrock, more stable." She looked at it. He was right. She moved her equipment 3 meters to the left. She set up on the outcrop. She looked at him. "How do you know about bedrock stability?" "I've been walking this territory for 11 years, he said. "You learn to read the ground." "That's what I do, read the ground." "In different ways," he said. She thought about this while she was taking the measurement. She thought about how 2 people could be doing the same fundamental thing, paying careful attention to the terrain they were in, and developing different knowledge from it because they were looking for different things, had different tools, were oriented toward different features of the landscape. "The shale line is higher than the most recent account put it," she said, recording the measurement, "by about 8 meters. That corresponds to a slip we had in the 3rd year, he said. A section of the upper face came down. I can show you where it landed. Please. He led her to the slip deposit. She recorded it. She drew the revised shale line in her field notebook, noting the discrepancy from the previous account and the probable cause. She noted the direction and velocity of the slip based on where the material had come to rest. You're calculating the original slope from the deposit pattern, he said, watching. It's how you reconstruct events you didn't witness from evidence they left behind. She looked up, like reading tracks. He looked at her steadily. Yes, exactly like that. They went on up the ridge. The measuring line went taut between them again and again. She at the upper point, he at the lower. The line pulled straight and level between them while she read the angle of elevation through the sighting scope. They had found a working rhythm for this, an efficiency that came from him anticipating when she needed the line held and when she needed to move. She had not told him how to anticipate it. He simply watched what she was doing and adjusted accordingly. She was, she thought, going to have to revise her expectation that clients were uniformly difficult in the field. At the top of the ridge, where the view opened up and the compass in her pocket was very still, and the cold wind was coming from the northwest, she looked at her measurements, and she looked at the physical ground, and she said, "The watershed runs 14 meters west of the current administrative line." Lord Castles sighed. "Yes, by 14 meters. Everything above this elevation drains west into the graving system, not east into Fenham's River. So Fenham's been using graving water. For 11 years, she closed her field notebook. I can produce a map that makes this unambiguous. The question is whether Lord Fenham will accept it." "He'll accept it," the Alpha King said. "He'd rather accept a cartographer's survey than a graving claim. It gives him a graceful position." She thought about this. "You're managing the politics." "That's most of what being a king is," he said. "Finding the arrangement of things that everyone can accept without losing too much face." "It's what maps do," she said slowly. "A map that shows disputed territory doesn't resolve the dispute by force. It resolves it by making the facts clear enough that the dispute becomes untenable." He looked at her. The wind was moving across the ridge and the view below was immense and the compass in her pocket was still. "Yes," he said, "exactly." She looked at him. He was looking at the view, but his attention, she had learned to read, was more complex than his gaze. He could be looking at the horizon and paying attention to something completely different, which was a quality she recognized because she did it too. "What is Meridian doing right now?" she asked. "Listening," he said. "To what?" "To everything being in the right place." Expansion Section D, second week at Graven, Integration Moments. The pack's third eldest, a man named Korath, who was responsible for the eastern approach roads, and had the particular competence of someone who had held the same responsibility for a very long time, came to find her in the map room on the 8th day of her stay. He knocked. She told him to come in. He looked at the panels she had pinned to the working wall. 3 of the 5 Northern Territories panels, plus the preliminary work on the graving western approach. And he was quiet for a moment, the way people were quiet when they encountered something that was more than they had expected. "These are accurate," he said. "That's the goal." The old holding map, the one in the council chamber, it shows the eastern road joining the main approach about half a mile south of where it actually joins. She nodded. "I noticed. I've marked the correction. I'm going to propose a full redraw to the council." Korath looked at her for a moment. He was a man in his 50s, with the careful quality of someone who had spent a long time not trusting things quickly and had developed good judgment as a result. "The old map was wrong for 20 years, he said. "We all just knew to subtract the half-mile when we were using it. A map that requires its users to make corrections isn't doing its job," Sable said. "No," he agreed, "it isn't." He looked at the preliminary western approach work. You've got the drainage noted here. The lower approach floods in spring. We've known it floods, but we've never had it on a map. If it's on the map, you can plan around it. You can mark the alternative route, note the flood timing based on snowmelt elevation, plan the infrastructure accordingly. Korath was quiet for a moment longer. Then, what do you need from me? An account of the Eastern Road history, when it was last modified, where the modifications were, and the maintenance records for the approach road drainage, if you have them. I have records going back 15 years. That would be very helpful. He nodded. He looked at the panels once more. You're going to redraw the whole holding map. If the council agrees. The council will agree. He said this with the certainty of someone who had sat on the council for a while and knew how it worked. The old map has been an embarrassment for years. Nobody's wanted to say it. She looked at him. Why didn't anyone redraw it? He considered. Because to redraw it, you'd have to admit it was wrong. And everyone had been using it for 20 years, and we'd all built our understanding of the territory around it. He paused. An accurate map that's inconvenient is sometimes harder to accept than an inaccurate one that's familiar. Sable thought about this for a long time after he left. She thought about it in relation to maps, and she thought about it in relation to other things. There were things she had understood about herself over the years that she had kept slightly misdrawn in her mental cartography, because drawing them accurately would require acknowledging that the old map was wrong. That the blank space was not a cartographic failure but a navigation reading. That the compass was not broken, but was pointing accurately at something she hadn't been willing to see. She picked up her pen. She started the redraw. She found over the second week that she liked the pack. This was not what she had expected. She had expected to respect them. They were a functional community with clear systems and evident care for each other, and she respected functional communities with clear systems. She had expected to be curious about them, because she was curious about everything. She had not expected to like them. She liked Doran, who had the quality of someone who was perpetually 3 steps ahead of any logistical problem, and had long since stopped finding this impressive, because it was simply what he did. She liked Old Wren, who made pronouncements about the old texts, and then immediately undermined them with observations about current reality that were approximately 4 times more interesting. She liked Korath and his 15 years of drainage records. She liked the hold cook, a woman named Bessa who had heard that the cartographer's apprentice from Thornwick liked seeded bread and had begun producing it for the morning meal without being asked, and without mentioning that she had heard this. She liked the pups, the children of pack members, who had initially watched her from careful distances, and then, in the way of children who have been watching something long enough to lose their wariness, had begun to drift closer. One of them, a girl of about 8 named Tessie, had asked her what the sighting scope was for, and Sable had explained it, and demonstrated it, and then handed it over, and Tessie had spent approximately half an hour looking through it at various things around the hold and providing running commentary. After that, Tessie appeared at the map room door most mornings. Sable had not intended to acquire a small curious companion. She was, however, finding that a small curious companion who asked questions about every notation and symbol and measurement in the survey was, in practice, quite useful for forcing her to articulate things she had previously held in her head as unspoken. "Why is the river line different from the road line?" Tessie asked on the 5th morning. "Because they're different kinds of thing. The river is natural, it's doing what water does, finding the lowest path. The road is made, it was put there by people making a decision about where they wanted to travel, different kinds of lines. But they both go places." "They do." Tessie considered this. "Is the bond a road or a river?" Sable looked at her. "What do you mean?" "Mama said the bond is like a road between the alpha and his mate, but Papa said it's more like a river," Tessie looked at the survey panel. Which is it? Sable thought about this seriously. She thought about the compass pointing northeast for 6 years. She thought about meridian pointing east for 4 years. The wolf half of a man she had not yet met, oriented towards something he couldn't see but knew was there. I think it might be a watershed, she said finally. The way 2 drainage systems flow toward the same low point from different directions because the terrain requires it. Tessie thought about this. That sounds complicated. It's actually very simple, Sable said. It's just that it takes a while to understand the terrain. Expansion Section E, the evening of the formal ceremony. Reflection before. She had asked Old Wren what the ceremony meant in practical terms. Old Wren had given her the answer in 3 parts. The wolf recognition, which was Meridian formally acknowledging the bond to the pack. The pack acknowledgement, which was the pack formally recognizing her as part of the territory. And the mate bond completion, which was something Old Wren described as the thing that was already true becoming also official. Already true? Sable had asked. The bond completes when both parties know it, Old Wren said. The ceremony doesn't make it true, it marks the truth. Sable had thought about this. Like filing a survey in the archive. Old Wren had looked at her for a moment. Myra taught you well. I've been thinking about it as a map, Sable said. The bond, the blank space and the pointing and the compass. It's been a map I've been drawing for 6 years, and I've finally reached the place I was mapping toward, and the ceremony is when I mark it complete and enter it in the record. Old Wren was quiet for a moment. That's not wrong, she said finally. But consider, the territory exists before you draw it. The map doesn't create the ground, it recognizes the ground. Sable had sat with this for several days. She sat with it again on the evening before the ceremony, in the garden where the spring was coming in, and the first green shoots were showing at the base of the stone wall. She had come out here because she thought better outdoors, with the sky above her and the ground under her feet and the territory visible in all directions. She thought about the territory existing before she drew it. She realized, always secretly believed this, or rather, she had always operated from it as an assumption without articulating it. Maps were not the territory. Maps were the best approximation she could produce of the territory, revised as new information arrived, never entirely finished, always a representation rather than a thing. This was why she didn't fill blank spaces. She was humble, in the deepest professional sense, about the difference between the map and the ground. What Old Wren was saying was that the bond was like the ground, not like the map of the ground. She had been thinking of the mate bond as something she was drawing, a map she was making, that would be complete when she had gathered enough information to fill in all the spaces. She had been doing what she did professionally, surveying, measuring, recording, and eventually rendering. But the territory had already been there. The compass pointing northeast for 6 years, at something that was already there and was waiting for her to arrive at it. She sat in the garden in the spring evening and she thought about this for a long time, and then she took the compass out of her pocket and she looked at it. She put her hand over it, so that all she could feel was the metal case and the slight warmth it had taken from being in her pocket. She thought about the first time she had noticed it behaving strangely, 10 years ago, when she was 14 years old and had just come to Myra's workshop and found the compass in her father's trunk. She had been 14, standing in this territory, for the first time, even though she hadn't known it yet. The ground had been there, she hadn't had a map for it. She uncovered the compass, it was still, she put it back in her pocket. She went inside to get ready for the morning. Expansion Section F, Extended Epilogue. The apprentice conversation expanded. The young surveyor's name was Penn, and she had come from the eastern edge of the territories with 3 years of field experience, and a firm opinion that her triangulation technique was excellent. Sable had assessed this opinion as approximately 70% correct, which was a good starting position, and had told her so, and they had gotten on well from there. Penn was working on the expansion maps of the Graving outer grounds on a morning when the light was good, and the garden was fully in its late summer abundance, and Sable had come out to consult on a contour question in the southern section. "The drainage here doesn't match the recorded position," Penn said, showing her the preliminary panel. Sable looked at it. "That's because the recorded position was taken from Korath's account, which is accurate for the spring drainage but not the summer drainage. The watercourse shifts when the snowmelt stops. So I should walk it in late spring and walk it again in summer. Mark both positions. Note that they're seasonal." Penn wrote this down in her field notebook. Then she looked up. "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask." "The blank space thing. Bessa told me about it. She said you used to leave the center blank in all your maps and nobody could figure out why, and then one day you stopped." Sable looked out at the garden. It was full summer, and she had been in this garden in its spring state, and it looked different now but was the same garden, which was a perfectly ordinary fact about gardens, and also something she had thought about extensively in relation to other things. "It's not that I stopped," she said. "It's that I knew what belonged there." "But you'd been leaving it blank for 10 years. 10 years, and then you knew." "And then I knew." Penn was quiet for a moment. "How?" Sable thought about how to explain this to someone who was 3 years into her field practice, and had excellent triangulation technique, and believed that cartographic problems had cartographic solutions. "Myra's first principle," she said. "Don't fill a blank space until you know what belongs there." "Right." The second half of that principle, which Myra never said aloud but which I think she always meant, is, trust that you will know. The blank space is not a failure. It's a placeholder for something you don't understand yet. And when you understand it, you'll know, because understanding has a quality that not understanding doesn't. Penn thought about this. "What quality?" "Stillness," Sable said. "When I filled the blank space, I was completely still, the way a compass is still when it has found what it was pointing at." She looked at the garden, which was full summer and abundant, and had the deep, settled quality of something that had been growing for a very long time. "The first principle is about discipline," she said. "Don't fill blank spaces too soon. The principle underneath the principle is about trust. The knowing will come." Penn wrote this down. Sable went back to the contour question. Expansion and expansion sections. Echo, expansion sections written. Expansion section G. Extended Graving arrival and old Wren scene. The approach to Graving was different from the surveyed approach. She had the maps. She had drawn the maps, the preliminary external rendering of the western and northern approaches, the ridge survey that informed the upper profile, the drainage annotations that showed how the snowmelt moved through the valley toward the hold. She knew the territory on paper. She had not anticipated that knowing the territory on paper and arriving in the territory in person would produce such different feelings. The hold itself was visible from the last ridge above the valley. She had expected this, because she had drawn that ridge, and she had marked the sightline to the hold's northern tower as a survey reference point, and she knew the angular relationship between the ridge and the tower top. She had known, on paper, that coming over that ridge would show her the hold. What she had not put on the map, could not have put on the map, not having been here, was the quality of the valley, the way the afternoon light fell across it, the way the hold sat in the valley like something that had grown there rather than been built, not imposingly, not trying to dominate the landscape, but settled into it the way old structures settled, becoming part of the topography rather than an interruption of it. Doran, who had been riding on her left since they crested the ridge, said nothing. He had the quality of someone who understood that some arrivals required silence. Aldrich on her right also said nothing. She looked at the valley for a moment. She felt the compass in her pocket, absolutely still. It's larger than I mapped it, she said. We're looking at it from inside now, Aldrich said. That's what I mean. Exteriors and interiors are different maps. Doran made a sound that was definitely a suppressed laugh this time. She could see him doing it, out of the corner of her eye. She filed this away as data and rode down into the valley. The household staff had been told she was coming. She had prepared herself for a range of responses to this information: wariness, formal courtesy, the studied neutrality of people who had been told to treat a guest correctly, and she had prepared herself to meet all of these responses with the same practical openness she applied to difficult terrain. You didn't resent terrain for being difficult. You found the route through it. The household staff was not, in practice, particularly difficult. They were curious. She could feel it as clearly as she could feel the ground under her feet, the particular alertness of people who were paying close attention to something new, assessing it, deciding what category it belonged to. This was not hostile. This was how any careful community interacted with an unknown. She did the same thing herself in new territory. She paid attention. She assessed. She gathered data before she reached conclusions. She gathered data. She noted that the hold cook, Bessa, had already produced a meal that included seeded bread, which meant either that seeded bread was a routine offering here, or that someone had communicated Sable's preference before she arrived, which seemed logistically improbable unless it had come from Aldrich, which it probably had. She noted this and did not mention it and ate the bread. She noted that Doran had arranged her accommodation in the south wing, which had windows facing the valley, good survey light in the morning, and had placed her surveying kit on the table by the larger window without being asked to, which meant either that Doran had thought about what a cartographer would need, or that he had been told what a cartographer would need, or both. She noted that the children of the pack, the pups, which was a word she had started using without thinking about it, which she filed as evidence of some kind of integration, were very present in the spaces where she moved, which she recognized as children paying attention to something new. She had been a child paying close attention to new things herself, and she could not find anything threatening in it. She noted that almost everyone she met looked at her with the same quality the Alpha King had looked at her with on the road to Thornwick. Not hostility, not assessment, but something more like recognition, as if they had been told something was going to arrive, and it had arrived, and the arrival confirmed something they had already believed. She filed all of this. Old Wren's room was in the eastern tower, which was the oldest part of the hold, and had the specific smell of old books and old stone and old fires. The room itself was not large, but it felt large, because it had been organized with the precision of someone who had spent 80 or 90 years developing the optimal arrangement of a finite space. Old Wren herself was in the chair by the window when Sable came in. She did not look up immediately. She was reading, a text in a script that Sable could not read from the doorway, old enough to have the look of something that had been copied multiple times from a more original source. "Sit," Old Wren said. "I'll be finished in a moment." Sable sat. She looked around the room, the books, the documents, the instruments on the shelf that were old enough to be curious and well-maintained enough to still be in use. She cataloged them with the same attention she gave to terrain features. Old Wren set down her text. She looked at Sable. "Show me," she said. After the compass and the conversation about the blank space and the prophecy's second half, the center gets known, not rendered. Sable asked the question she had been building toward since she arrived. "What does the prophecy say happens after?" she asked. "After the center is known." Old Wren looked at her steadily. "Why do you ask?" "Because prophecies are usually about arrival at something, a destination, a resolved state, and what I'm wondering is whether what I'm arriving at is a destination or a beginning." Old Wren was quiet for a long moment. The light from the eastern window was moving across the stone floor in the particular angle of late afternoon, and the room was very still. "The old text says this," Old Wren said, finally. "The king's line finds its center and the center holds." Sable thought about this. The center holds, not the center is reached. Not the center is reached. A center that holds is an ongoing process, not a single moment. "Yes, that's consistent," Sable said slowly, "with how territory works. You don't finish surveying territory. You produce the best map you can given the information available, and you update it as new information arrives, and you're always in relationship with it, not done with it." Old Wren looked at her with an expression that Sable was beginning to classify as approval. "Yes," she said, "you understand." "I think I'm starting to," Sable said. "I think I've been confusing completion with understanding. A finished map is a representation. It's never the same as the territory being finished." Old Wren picked up her text again. "The pack has been waiting for someone who would understand the distinction," she said. "The kings before Aldrich thought the bond was a finished thing once it was made. They treated it as solved." She paused. "It is not solved. It is ongoing." "I know," Sable said. "Good," Old Wren said, and went back to her reading. Expansion Section H, the Council Session, Political Arc Resolution. The Northern Territories Boundary Session was held on the third week of Sable's stay. In the large council chamber, with the old holding map on the wall that Sable had not yet formally proposed to redraw. She had not proposed it because she had been waiting for the right moment. A map that accurately showed an inconvenient truth required the right conditions for introduction. People had to be ready to see the truth, not just resistant to the disruption of replacing the familiar with the accurate. She had been watching the council for 3 weeks. She had decided that the right moment was this one. Lord Castle and Lord Fenham were present via their senior representatives, who had come for the boundary confirmation. Sable unrolled the Eastern Ridge Survey, the completed panel, inked with the precision that a month of work and 3 separate field visits had produced, and she laid it across the council table. "The watershed boundary," she said, "runs 14 meters west of the current administrative line at this elevation." She pointed. "The physical evidence is unambiguous. The drainage pattern, the soil composition, the historical slope data, all of it confirms that the boundary as marked for the last 11 years is in error." Lord Fenham's representative, a careful man named Saurik, who had been present at the original Thornwick meetings, looked at the map with the expression of someone who was seeing something he had suspected for a while and was not entirely surprised by. 14 meters, Saurik said. "At the ridge apex. The divergence narrows below the tree line, where the watercourse has been correctly attributed to the Fenham drainage system in prior surveys. But at the ridge, the water flows west into the graving system. Has flowed west at that specific elevation for as long as the drainage record exists." She paused. "I can show you the records if it would be helpful." Saurik looked at the map for a long time. "The compact specifies the watershed as the governing boundary," said Aldrich from the head of the table. He said it without emphasis, a neutral statement of existing law, not a demand. "The survey establishes the watershed. The boundary follows." Saurik looked at his counterpart from the castle side, who was a woman named Dara, who was already nodding in the manner of someone who had reviewed the water compact before coming to this meeting, and had known exactly how it was going to go. "Lord Fenham's rights to the eastern tributaries remain unaffected," Sable said. "The 14-meter adjustment at the ridge doesn't change the distribution downstream. His water rights are actually clearer under the corrected survey than they were under the disputed one." Saurik looked at the map again. "Clearer how?" "Because the corrected line puts the ambiguity to rest. Under the disputed line, anyone could argue that the attribution of the eastern tributaries was suspect because the ridge boundary was unsettled. Under the corrected line, The eastern tributaries are unambiguously Phenom water, because the governing watershed is unambiguously established. Sarek was quiet. She watched him process this, the way a cartographer watched terrain reveal itself as you approached it, feature by feature, until the whole picture was visible. "That's an argument for accepting the correction," he said finally. "It's an accurate description of the legal reality," she said. "What it argues for, that's your judgment." He looked at Aldrich. Aldrich said nothing. He was looking at the map with the same attention he gave to everything, comprehensive, patient, entirely present. "Lord Phenom," Sarek said eventually, "would accept the corrected survey as binding, provided the eastern tributary rights are formally annotated in the survey text." "They will be," Sable said. "Then we're agreed." Dara from the castle side had already signed the confirmation copy that Doran had quietly produced and placed in front of her while Sarek was speaking. This was, Sable thought, very efficient logistics, and she noted it as further evidence that Doran was 3 steps ahead of every practical problem in this building. The boundary was settled. After the session, Korath found her in the map room. He looked at the eastern ridge panel, which she had rehung after the council meeting. "You gave Phenom's man a reason to accept it," he said. "The reason was accurate. Most accurate things don't offer reasons to accept themselves. They just are what they are." She thought about this. A map that doesn't help its users navigate is just a drawing. The accuracy has to be presented in a way that people can use. Korath was quiet for a moment. "You're going to be very good at this," he said. She looked at the map. "I'm already good at this," she said. "I'm learning to be good at it for a different territory." Expansion section I. Aldrich's visit to the map room. The conversation about kings and territory. He came to the map room late in the second week, in the hour after the evening meal when the hold was settling into its night rhythms, and the light was the particular amber of old stone holding the last of the day. She was annotating the eastern tributary rights, as she had promised Sarek she would do, in the precise margin script she used for legal notations. The work required attention. Legal language had the same relationship to ordinary language that survey notation had to conversational description, which was that it needed to be exact in ways that allowed no ambiguity. He knocked on the open door. She had come to understand that he always knocked on open doors, which was a courtesy she had not encountered much in clients, and which she had filed under useful qualities in the mental catalog she kept of people. "Am I interrupting?" The notation requires concentration, but not exclusive concentration. She moved one of the rolled surveys off the second chair to give him somewhere to sit. "Come in." He sat. He looked at the working wall, the 5 Northern Territories panels plus the preliminary Graving Holdings work, plus the 3 reference maps she had pinned for the tributary annotation. He had the quality, looking at it, of someone seeing the territory from above for the first time. "You see it differently than I do," he said. "Then you see the territory." "Yes, I walk it. I know it by walking." He looked at the largest panel, the one that covered the widest geographic area. "You see it whole." "I see a representation of it whole," she said. "I've walked every inch of what's on these panels. The map is the result of walking it, not a substitute. But you can hold the whole thing in your head at once." "In spatial terms, yes. In tactile terms, no. I know what the upper shale line feels like underfoot. I know the way the runoff sounds in the spring channel. That's the walk knowledge. That's different from the map knowledge." He was quiet for a moment. "I have the walk knowledge," he said, "for every part of this territory, 11 years of walking it." "I know. I don't have the map knowledge. The ability to hold the whole simultaneously and see how the parts relate to each other." He looked at the panels. "I've been making decisions about the territory with one kind of knowledge. Working with you, I'm starting to see what I've been missing." Sable set down her annotation pen. The council sessions I've observed, you're very good at the whole picture. You hold multiple considerations simultaneously. The political geography, the water rights, the trade relationships. That's different. Is it? He thought about this, maybe not. Walk knowledge and map knowledge are different tools for the same territory, she said. The best survey work I've ever done has been when I had both. When I'd walked the terrain thoroughly enough to feel it under my feet, and I'd also drawn it carefully enough to see how it fit into the larger pattern. She paused. I think governing might work the same way. He looked at her. Is that what you see me doing? It's what I see you doing well, she said. You have the walk knowledge. The map knowledge is something we could build together if she stopped, if she stayed, if the blank space resolved the way she thought it was resolving. If, he said. She looked back at her annotation. I'm going to finish this notation, she said, and then I want to ask you something. I'll wait. She finished the notation. It took approximately 20 minutes, and he was quiet in the chair while she worked, and when she looked up he was not looking at the panels. He was looking at his hands, which were folded loosely on the table in front of him, with the stillness she had come to recognize as the quality of someone who was genuinely at rest rather than waiting. She had been thinking about what she wanted to ask. She had been thinking about it since the conversation with old Wren about the center holding, and the conversation with Korath about the map that required reasons to be accepted, and the conversation with Penn that hadn't happened yet, but that she was thinking about in advance. What do you want, she asked, not from the bond, not from the prophecy, or the pack, or any of the things that were already in motion before I walked through the door of Myra's workshop. What do you want, for your own reasons, that you would want even if the bond wasn't part of it? He looked at her for a long moment. Someone who understands the territory, he said. Someone who can hold the map knowledge. Someone who will look at the things I've been making decisions about for 11 years and tell me what the blank spaces are. She thought about this. Those are professional qualifications, she said. That's the cartographer you want. Yes, he paused, and what else? You asked what I want for my own reasons. I gave you the professional reasons. You can hear that I'm leaving something out. He was right. She could hear it. She had gotten very good over 2 weeks at hearing what wasn't said in the structure of what was. Someone who doesn't fill blank spaces too soon, he said. Someone who is precise about what she knows and precise about what she doesn't know and isn't frightened by either. Someone who argues with border lords because the map is right and she knows it's right and she isn't going to say otherwise to make someone comfortable. He looked at his hands again. Someone who asks the right questions. What questions have I asked that were right? The one you just asked, and the one on the ridge about what Meridian was doing. And every question you've asked in the council sessions, which you've mostly asked of Doran afterward rather than in the session, because you're still mapping the territory before you mark things on it. She filed this observation under the category of he pays very careful attention to me, which she had been filing things under for 2 weeks, and which was getting fairly full. I want to tell you something, she said, that I want to say for my own reasons, not because the bond makes it easier to say. Then tell me. I don't fill blank spaces until I know what belongs there, she said. I know what belongs in mine. She looked at him steadily. You. The room was very still. Not because the compass says so, she said. Because I've surveyed this territory for 3 weeks, and I trust my own measurements. He looked at her for a long time. Then, I've been waiting for you to know for a while. I know, she said, you've been patient. Meridian helped with the patience. Does Meridian have a lot of patience? Meridian has been pointing east for 4 years, he said. He has more patience than I do. I've been compensating. She looked at him. Something shifted, not dramatically, not in a way she could put into precise cartographic terms, but in the way terrain sometimes shifted at the moment you understood the underlying structure. When the landscape stopped being a collection of separate features and became a coherent whole. When the territory became a map. Then stop compensating, she said. He did. Expansion Section J, the morning after the ceremony. First day of the afterward. She woke before dawn. This was not unusual. She had always woken before dawn. Myra had noted it as a professional advantage, the cartographer's appetite for the morning light, the hour when the shadows were long and the terrain features most readable. She had been waking before dawn for as long as she could remember, and she saw no reason to stop. She lay in the bed in the south wing room with its good survey-light windows, and she listened to the hold. A hold at dawn was different from a hold at any other time. There were sounds, the cook fires starting in the kitchen building, the sound of the earliest risers on the stone paths, the distant particular sound she had learned to identify as Korath doing the morning check of the eastern approach gate. These sounds were in their places, which meant she had been here long enough to know where the sounds went. She thought about old Wren's words, the center holds. She thought about what holding meant. Holding was an active thing, not a static state. A center that held was a center that continued to be the center, that continued to be the point that everything else was oriented toward, not by staying the same, but by being present, by being real, by being the kind of fixed point that a compass could find because it was consistently, reliably there. She thought about this for a while in the pre-dawn quiet. Then she got up and found her field notebook and her pen, and she wrote, "A center that holds is not a center that doesn't change. It is a center that is knowable, that can be found, that doesn't move arbitrarily or without reason. The compass can point to it because it is real enough to be pointed to." She stopped writing. She thought about the compass. She thought about the 6 years it had been pointing northeast, and the way it had gone still when Aldrich walked through the door of the workroom, and the way it had remained still in the 4 months since. She wrote, "The bond is not the absence of movement. It is the certainty of center. Wherever I am, whatever I am doing, I now know where the center is. I don't need the compass to point anymore. I know." She closed the notebook. She went to the window. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, the particular gradation from deep blue to the first gray that preceded color, the liminal hour that she had always loved because it was the hour when the world was readable in outline before it was readable in detail. Below in the hold, the morning sounds were continuing. Bessa's kitchen fire, Korath's gate, the sound of Doran's boot on the stone, which she had learned to distinguish from everyone else's because Doran walked with a specific economy of step that she had filed under consistently useful pattern. She heard a different step on the stone below her window. She looked down. Aldrich was on the outer path as he was most mornings, walking the perimeter in the pre-dawn. He looked up. She raised a hand. He raised a hand in return. She went downstairs. She walked out through the side door onto the outer path. The morning air was cool and the stone was damp, and the territory was spreading out around them in the gray light. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning." He looked at her with the expression she had catalogued in the days after the ceremony, which was different from the expression he had given her on the Thornwick Road. The Thornwick expression had been recognition of something not yet arrived. This was recognition of something present. "I was writing in my field notebook," she said. "At this hour. I work things out in the notebook. I've been working something out." "What?" "The difference between holding and not changing." She walked beside him on the outer path. The territory was coming into definition around them as the light increased. "I used to think the center was a fixed point, something that didn't move. And now I think it's something that is consistently findable, not static present. There's a difference." He was quiet for a moment. Meridian thinks the difference is important. "It is important. A fixed point that doesn't change is a landmark, useful but passive. A center that holds is something that continues to actively be the center, something you can continue to find your bearings from, even as everything else moves. The morning light was coming up over the eastern ridge. She could see the line of it, the ridge she had walked, the shale deposits and the watershed and the boundary that was now correctly drawn on the best map she had ever made. "I am going to be finding my bearings from you," she said, "for a long time." "Yes," he said. "I want you to know that's not a small statement for a cartographer." "I know," he said. They walked the perimeter of the outer wall in the morning light, and the territory defined itself around them in the gradual, unhurried way of something that had been there for a very long time and would continue to be there, and the compass in her pocket was still.